2 weeks ago, Judge Susan Graber of the Ninth Circuit did something that federal judges almost never do. She addressed the American public directly. Quote, "Above all, I ask those who are watching this case unfold to retain faith in our judicial system for just a little longer," end quote. A federal judge breaking the fourth wall is a distress signal. It reflects how worried some judges are about Americans losing confidence in their courts at a time when the rule of law is under sustained pressure. Judge Graber's words were a plea to Americans to hold on to one of the few institutions that are still standing between democracy and its descent into authoritarianism. Her warning came in a dissent in the Portland Emergency Powers case, a case that would determine whether a president may deploy federal troops onto American streets based on little more than a self-declared rebellion. This week, the full Ninth Circuit agreed to review the case, meaning for now, the district court's initial restraining order blocking the deployment still stands until the Ninth Circuit rules. Unless, of course, the Supreme Court's decision in the related Illinois case preempts it. Now, should the Supreme Court endorse the administration's use of emergency powers, it could give Trump legal cover to interfere in the 2026 election. Things like stationing troops at polling sites, seizing voting machines, detaining election officials. All of that could be allowed under the pretext of protecting the vote. In her dissent, Judge Graber noted, quote, "We rule on facts, not on suppositions or conjecture, and certainly not on fabrication or propaganda," end quote. And she urged her colleagues to reverse the ruling before the illegal deployment of troops under false pretenses can occur. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but it strikes me that a judge should never have to remind her colleagues that facts matter. This is not normal, but nothing about this moment is normal. Judge Graber's words reflect the gravity of where we are and how fragile the guardrails of truth and law have become. And the new idea is being normalized as the big lie 2.0, if you will. It's the idea that Donald Trump will somehow remain president of the United States after the 2028 presidential election. As Judge Michael Luttig put it in his latest essay for The Atlantic, quote, "The founders of our nation foresaw a figure like Trump, a demagogue who would ascend to the presidency and refuse to relinquish power to a successor chosen by the American people in a free and fair election. Thomas Jefferson warned that such an incumbent, if narrowly defeated, would pretend false votes, foul play, hold possession of the reins of government. Were that moment ever to come, the founders believed, it would mark the demise of the nation that they had conceived, bringing to a calamitous end the greatest experiment in self-government ever attempted by man," end quote. As Judge Luttig notes in the same piece, the federal judiciary is under extraordinary pressure. It is now confronting a president who's actively trying to amass the powers of a king, who's given Americans ample reason to believe that he intends to defy the Constitution's two-term limit. Those Trump 2028 hats scattered around the Oval Office, they're not a joke. They're part of an effort to normalize something that is unequivocally illegal and unconstitutional. Watch this.
And then after that, we'll go for another 4 years because, you know what, they spied on my campaign. We should get a redo.
He's going to get a third term. So Trump 28, Trump is going to be president in 28, and people just ought to get accommodated with that.
So what about the 22nd Amendment?
There's many different alternatives. At the appropriate time, we'll lay out what the plan is. But there's a plan, and President Trump will be the president in 28.
I would love to do it. And I have my best numbers ever. It's very terrible. I have my best numbers. If you read it, am I not ruling it out? You'll have to tell me. All I can tell you is that we have a great group of people, which they don't. They have Jasmine Crockett, a low IQ person.
And just as often as Donald Trump flirts with it, you'll hear him and his allies suddenly claim, well, that's not allowed.
It's a very interesting thing. I have the best numbers for any president in many years, any president. And I would say that if you read it, it's pretty clear. I'm not allowed to run. It's too bad.
If you read the Constitution, it says it's not. But if he says he has some different circumstances that might be able to go around the Constitution, but that's up to him. We got a long way to go.
But you're open to it.
Well, I think that there's going to have to be an evaluation from President Trump's viewpoint to the Constitution.
Well, there is the 22nd Amendment. I think the president knows, and he and I have talked about the constrictions of the Constitution, as much as so many of the American people lament that. I don't see the path for that.
It's a whole lot of word salad in there. This pretend debate about Trump serving a third term is the same tactic we saw with Project 2025 last year. Develop the plan, float the idea, pretend it's a joke, accuse Democrats of being hysterical, dial the joke back, seize power, and then reintroduce it. And suddenly it all starts to feel normal, because that's the point. Normalization, to make flirtation with authoritarianism seem like a legitimate debate. If the last few months have taught us anything, it's that when Trump tells you what he plans to do, believe him the first time and prepare accordingly, which is why the work of the lower courts right now is so important. At best, these courts are actively working to uphold constitutional democracy. At minimum, they are documenting its dismantling in real time, creating a legal and historical record that cannot be erased, rewritten, or easily denied. Notably, these lower court judges have assumed a responsibility that the Supreme Court has so far declined to take on, reasserting the judiciary's duty to check presidential overreach. In her dissent, Judge Graber suggested that her colleagues are, quote, abdicating our judicial responsibility by approving emergency powers where no emergency existed. She noted a core constitutional principle, quote, except in true emergencies and by design of the founders and Congress, our civil society resolves its disputes without domestic military intervention, end quote. Judge Graber is far from alone. Across the country, lower courts are pushing back, rejecting Donald Trump's unlawful power grabs. In the Portland case, District Court Judge Karen Immergut, a Trump appointee, wrote that the administration's claim of a rebellion to justify federalizing the National Guard was untethered to the facts, noting that while courts owe the executive significant deference, great deference is not equivalent to ignoring the facts on the ground. In the Illinois case, the Seventh Circuit affirmed that political opposition is not rebellion, explaining that rebellion requires deliberate, organized violence against the government and that peaceful protest does not meet that standard. That court also rejected the claim that a president is the sole judge of whether emergency conditions exist. Judges are also drawing the line against militarizing civilian life, warning that if Trump's deployments are accepted, virtually any protest or dissent or anything he doesn't like, really, could be labeled rebellion and met with troops. Judges are standing up for state sovereignty, a principle that Republicans once deeply championed before aligning themselves with Trump. These rulings reiterate that federal intervention requires lawful conditions, not political motives. Judges are resisting the shadow docket as a vehicle for autocratic change. They're calling out the misuse of emergency appeals to the Supreme Court to enact sweeping legal transformations without full judicial scrutiny. Judges are accustomed to operating under the radar, but more and more, many of them are breaking with that tradition because they see the Democratic backsliding. They're trying to warn their colleagues and the country. You can see in these rulings that lower court judges are writing not just for the lawyers in the room or the parties to the cases, but for the American public. They're laying out the stakes for our democracy in plain language. Which brings me to an important point. Something profound is happening in the lower courts that can be easy to overlook. In this moment, with the rule of law under severe strain, many judges are finding their role naturally expanding. They're not just interpreting statutes and issuing orders. They've become the last line of defense for factual truth in a political environment where mass distortion has become a central tool of power. And since Trump returned to office, courts across the country have been doing something that used to be extraordinarily rare. They're telling the United States government in plain terms, we don't believe you. We don't trust you. You are not all-powerful. And establishing that record matters because there is a coordinated effort underway by the Trump administration to purge inconvenient facts from the American story, including the truth about the 2020 election and about January 6th. This administration is not only testing constitutional boundaries, it desperately wants to control and revise the historical record itself. This week, 2 federal prosecutors were suspended for accurately describing January 6th, what you are looking at with your own eyes right now, as a riot, and noting Trump's role in it. The truth undermines the original big lie, the myth of a stolen election. So the truth is punished. This campaign to rewrite the historical record extends to America's cultural institutions and even to the White House itself. Directives to the Smithsonian to alter exhibits, the symbolic demolition of parts of the White House to rebuild or to build a gilded ballroom. These are not cosmetic changes. They are, in fact, efforts to overwrite American history, to substitute it with one man's preferred narrative. As the scholar Jason Stanley put it, the message being sent to the American public is this: There is no history. I am the start of history. Understanding that this is a defining feature of authoritarian movements, the past must be rewritten, literally bulldozed, so that the leader becomes the source of the truth and of history. George Orwell once described the authoritarian project as the constant rewriting of history, day by day, almost minute by minute, so that any item of news or any expression of opinion which conflicted with the needs of the moment was allowed to remain on the record. That's why the work of the lower courts matters so much right now. Judges across the country are bearing witness at a critical moment in American history. What these judges are doing is part of the broader resistance to authoritarianism, a key component of defending democracy alongside the civic action that's happening on the ground. American judges create the official record, the legal, factual, historical account of what happened in a given moment. And that record is one of the last formal safeguards that we have against the rewriting of history, meant to outlast any single person or any single administration. Every dissent, every opinion, every factual finding is a shield against revisionism, a counter-narrative to propaganda. And Trump knows it. That's why he routinely and publicly insults and belittles judges. But according to Judge Luttig, despite the very real threats to their safety, the lower courts are determined to support and defend the Constitution according to their oath, and that's what they're going to do. And while the judges hold the line on their end, they ask that you not give up. Judge Graber asks that you hold on for just a little longer. Judge Luttig, who has himself faced threats to his life for advising former Vice President Mike Pence not to bend to Trump's pressure to overturn the results of the 2020 election, captures the deeper stakes for our country. Quote, "There is a truth. There are facts. And it doesn't matter what anyone else says from MAGA or, frankly, what the President of the United States says. There is a thing called truth in this world. There always has been, and there always will be. The day that the federal courts of the United States of America attempt or acquiesce in the denial and the rewriting of truth is the day that America falls." End quote.